The morning Lionel Kendrick rode onto the Turner property, Etta Turner was elbow-deep in a fence-post hole, her hair pinned back with a single weathered stick, sweat tracing a clean line down the side of her neck, and she did not so much as look up when the shadow of his horse fell across the dirt in front of her. She had heard about him, of course. Everyone in Harlan County, Texas had heard about Lionel Kendrick by the spring of 1882. He was the kind of man rumors attached themselves to like burrs on a wool blanket. Some folks said he had ridden with a cattle outfit out of San Antonio before striking out on his own. Others said he had come into a modest inheritance from a cattle-baron uncle and was looking to expand what he already had. The talk that made Etta's jaw tight, though, was the talk that reached her through Mabel Pruitt at the dry goods store, who had it from a reliable source, or so she claimed, that Lionel Kendrick had his eye on the Turner land specifically. The 400 acres of prime grassland and creek-fed pasture that sat just southwest of Harlan's main road, the land her father, Hugh Turner, had broken his body and his spirit building into something worth inheriting. Hugh Turner had died 14 months before Lionel rode through the gate. He had gone quietly, the way good men sometimes did, his lungs giving out on a cold November morning with Etta sitting beside him, holding his roughened hand and telling him the cattle were fat and the fence along the south ridge was holding just fine, even though that last part was a lie. She had fixed that fence herself in December alone, in weather that had no business existing in Texas. She was 24 years old, unmarried, and the sole owner of land that 3 separate men in Harlan County had already attempted to acquire through polite suggestion, legal pressure, and one thoroughly unpleasant visit from a lawyer named Hicks who had arrived with a fabricated promissory note that Etta had sent back with him still folded in his breast pocket, and a very clear message delivered in language that would have made her father proud despite himself. So when Lionel Kendrick rode through the gate on a buckskin horse and called out a pleasant good morning, she dug her post hole digger a little deeper and said, "Gates for guests and customers. I don't take visitors on a Wednesday." "Then I'll come back Thursday," he said. She looked up then because the answer surprised her. Most men, when she used that particular tone, either bristled or apologized. He did neither. He sat easy in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a plain dark hat that had seen better days and a canvas work jacket that looked like it had actually been used for work. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with a square jaw and dark eyes that were doing the thing she disliked most in men's eyes, which was looking at everything around her rather than at her. He was looking at her land. She straightened up, wiped her hands on the sides of her dungarees and fixed him with the look she reserved for lawyers and livestock thieves. "What is it you want, Mr. Kendrick?" His eyes came back to her, and there was a flicker of something in them that she could not quite identify. Not surprise, exactly. More like he had been caught doing something and was not particularly embarrassed about it. "My name's reached you then," he said. "Your name's reached most of Harlan County," she replied, "along with a fair amount of speculation about your intentions." He swung down from the horse in one smooth motion and stood with the reins in his hand, not advancing, which she noted. A man who did not walk toward a woman uninvited was either well-mannered or strategically cautious, and she had not yet determined which applied here. "I was hoping to introduce myself properly and ask if you might be willing to share some of your time and your knowledge of this area," he said. "I've recently purchased the Dawes Tract on the north side of the county. I'm new to this particular stretch of Texas, and I'm told you know this land better than anyone." "The Dawes Tract," she said carefully. 260 acres. I intend to run cattle." "That land is decent enough for what you want," she allowed, "but it's a ways from here." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the way he said it was neither obsequious nor flirtatious. It was simply acknowledgement. She studied him for another moment. He stood steady under the examination, not shifting his weight or filling the silence with unnecessary words. That alone was mildly impressive. "I've got work to finish," she said finally. "Come back Thursday morning, 7 o'clock. I'll give you 20 minutes. He put 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, turned, and remounted his horse. He rode back out through the gate without looking back. She watched him go, then looked at the fence post in her hand, then looked back at the empty gate. Something about the whole exchange sat with her through the rest of the afternoon in a way she could not entirely dismiss. He came back Thursday at precisely 7 o'clock. She was in the yard with a cup of coffee and a tally book, and she handed him the coffee without offering him a seat because she only had the 1 cup made, which was the honest truth, and she was not the sort of woman to invent excuses where honest ones existed. He accepted the coffee with apparent genuine gratitude, drank it standing, and asked her his questions about water sources and cattle trails and the temperament of the soil in the dry months. She answered them plainly, because there was no reason not to. Information about the land was not a secret she was obligated to keep. She was sharp and direct and thorough, and when she finished, he handed the cup back and said, "You know this land the way some people know a language they were born speaking." She was not accustomed to being complimented with any kind of precision. Most men either ignored her competence entirely or praised it in a way that felt like being patted on the head. That particular observation was neither of those things, and it landed on her with a small, uncomfortable warmth that she chose to examine later in private. "Is that your 20 minutes?" she asked. "I believe I've run a little over," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile and yet unmistakably contained one. She did not invite him back. He came back anyway the following Wednesday, and this time he had a question about the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the county, whether it ran consistent through July or tended to slow. It was a reasonable question. She answered it. He thanked her and left. This pattern continued for 3 weeks, and it was during the 3rd week that Mabel Prout caught Etta at the dry goods store and said, with a meaningful look that Etta found aggressively transparent, "I hear Lionel Kendrick's been calling on you regular." "He's been asking practical questions about the county," Etta said, selecting a length of rope from the rack. "Practical questions," Mabel repeated, in the tone she used when she thought something was adorably naive. "The land, Mabel." "Of course," Mabel said, in the same tone. Etta paid for her rope and walked out with her thoughts considerably less settled than she had walked in with. She had not been giving the visits much deliberate thought, which was perhaps, she now realized, a deliberate choice in itself. When she applied honest analysis to the situation, she found the conclusion uncomfortable. He was new to the county. He had bought land adjacent to hers, not connected to it, but not distant either. He came consistently with questions that could have been answered by a number of other people in Harlan County, and he looked at her land every single time he arrived. She thought of the lawyer Hicks and his fabricated promissory note. She thought of William Cotter, who had proposed marriage to her 3 months after her father died in what he had apparently believed was a seamless connection between matrimony and land acquisition. She thought of Dale Renfield, who had made a formal offer to purchase for a figure that was insultingly low, and then had the audacity to appear hurt when she declined it. Men wanted her land. That was a fact as plain as rainfall in spring. She was a woman alone with 400 acres of the best-watered grassland in the county, and she represented, to a certain category of man, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. She rode home that evening with her jaw set and her mind made up about several things. When Lionel Kendrick came the following Wednesday at what had apparently become his usual time, she met him at the gate rather than in the yard, and she did not offer pleasantries. "I'd like to ask you something directly," she said. "Go ahead," he said, and he swung down from the horse in that same unhurried way. "Why do you keep coming here?" He tilted his head slightly, as though the directness of the question had genuinely registered with him rather than merely annoyed him. "I've been coming to ask you questions. Questions you could ask a dozen other people in this county," she said. "Floyd Adler's been here 30 years and he'll talk to anyone who stands still long enough. You don't need to ride out to my property to ask about creek levels." He was quiet for a moment, not a defensive quiet, more like a considering quiet. That irritated her because it was hard to be appropriately sharp with someone who refused to become reactive. "You're right," he said. "I could ask other people. I've been coming because I find your company more worth the ride." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to be honest with me, Mr. Kendrick, completely and plainly honest. Are you interested in acquiring my land?" Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, she thought. More like genuine surprise, followed by something she could only describe as the look of a man who suddenly understood a situation more fully than he had a moment before. "No," he said. "You look at it every time you come here," she said. "You look at it the way I look at it, which is the way a person looks at something they want." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I look at it because it's beautiful land and it's well kept, and it tells me a great deal about the person who tends it. That's not the same as wanting it. Men have tried to take this land from me 4 different ways since my father died," she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice that she usually managed to keep under the surface. "By law, by marriage, by persuasion, and by fraud. Every single one of them came to me with a pleasant face and a reasonable opening line. So you'll forgive me if I apply some scrutiny to a man who rides out here weekly and looks at my acres while he talks." He held her gaze through all of that. He did not look away, and he did not look offended, and he did not launch into reassurances. He simply listened. That was, she realized, extremely uncommon. "I understand why you'd think that," he said finally. "And I won't tell you it's foolish to think it because it isn't, but it's not true." He paused. "I won't keep coming if you'd rather I didn't. I'm not a man who forces himself where he's not wanted." She searched his face for the tell that men always eventually showed, the flicker of calculation or wounded entitlement. She did not find it. "I'm not saying don't come," she said, which surprised her even as she said it. "I'm saying be honest with me about what you want." He looked at her then, directly and without flinching, and what she saw in his face was something she had not expected, which was a plain and unguarded honesty that sat so open in his expression it was almost startling. "What I want," he said quietly, "is to know you better. That's the whole of it. The land has nothing to do with it." She studied him for a long moment in the warm Texas morning. The mockingbirds were arguing in the mesquite trees along the fence line. Her best milk cow was making low complaints from the barn about being overdue for her morning routine. The wind carried the smell of creek water and dry grass, the smell of her land, the smell she had grown up with and could not imagine being separated from. "Then come on in and I'll put on coffee," she said. "And you can tell me something about yourself for once, because you know a considerable amount about my county and I know nearly nothing about you." The look that crossed his face then was not triumph. It was something quieter than that, and she thought it might have been relief. Over the following weeks, a new pattern established itself. He came on Wednesdays and sometimes Saturdays, and they sat at the weathered table on her porch or walked the fence lines together while she checked on things and they talked. He was from east of San Antonio, the younger of 2 brothers, and his older brother Clarence had inherited the family's modest ranch, while Lionel had spent the better part of 8 years working various cattle outfits across Texas and into New Mexico territory before his uncle's death had left him with enough to purchase his own land. He was 30 years old, she learned, which made him 6 years her senior, though he did not carry those years in any way that felt like weight. He listened more than he spoke, which she initially interpreted as strategic and later came to understand was simply his nature. He had opinions when asked and offered them plainly without turning them into proclamations. He was comfortable with silence in a way that most people were not, which meant that their silences together felt companionable rather than awkward. He noticed things. He noticed when a section of her northern fence had weakened after a wet week in April and mentioned it without making it into a lesson. He noticed when one of her calves was favoring a leg and suggested correctly that the hoof wanted looking at. He did not offer these observations as intrusions but as simple things he had seen, the way a person who is actually paying attention to their surroundings shares what they find. And he never, not once, referenced the land in a way that suggested acquisition. He spoke about it the way she spoke about it, as a living thing with character and demands, and a particular kind of beauty that was not decorative but essential. By May she had admitted to herself, privately and with some reluctance, that she looked forward to Wednesdays with a warmth that was separate from and considerably greater than the warmth she felt about any other scheduled part of her week. This did not stop the doubt. The doubt was not irrational. It had been earned through specific and repeated experience, and she was not the kind of woman who discarded good evidence because it was inconvenient. What she had not anticipated was that the event which forced the issue would come not from Lionel, but from outside. She learned about it on a Tuesday in late May, from Floyd Adler of all people, who stopped her on the road and told her, with the apologetic expression of a man delivering news he wishes he did not have, that a man named Stanton Beal had filed a claim with the county office asserting that a section of the Turner property's eastern boundary was, in fact, part of the original Beal land grant from 1858 and had been erroneously deeded to Hugh Turner in 1863. She went cold all over in the warm May sunshine. Stanton Beal was 53 years old, a cattle broker who operated out of a fine office in Harlan with carpeted floors and a secretary. He had been acquiring land in the county for the better part of a decade, steadily and methodically, and the piece he was now claiming amounted to 60 acres of her most productive pasture land, including a full stretch of the creek. She rode straight to the county office, where the clerk, a thin young man named Dobbs who was clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation, confirmed that yes, the claim had been filed and yes, it would go before a review in June and yes, she would need documentation to contest it. She rode home and went through every paper her father had ever kept in the locked tin box under his bed. The original deed was there. The 1863 transfer document was there. She spread them on the kitchen table and went through them line by line until midnight. The paperwork looked right to her, but she was not a lawyer and she knew it. She was sitting on the porch the next morning, which was a Wednesday, with the tin box beside her and exhaustion sitting behind her eyes, when Lionel's buckskin came through the gate. He looked at her face and stopped any casual greeting he might have had before it left his mouth. "What's happened?" he said. She told him. She told him plainly and completely, the way she told most things, because she had found that including all the information was always more useful than editing it. He listened with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that mattered, which was total and still. When she finished, he said, "Let me look at the papers." She handed them to him without deliberation, which she noticed was a kind of trust she had not consciously decided to extend. He sat down on the porch step and went through the documents slowly and carefully, and she watched him and did not say anything. "The 1863 deed is clear," he said after some time. "Your father's name is on it with the full eastern boundary described. What Beal would need to prove is that the original 1858 grant was never properly superseded. He'd need the original Beal grant document. Do you know if it exists?" "I don't know Beal's business," he said, "but I know someone who might help. There's a land attorney in San Marcos named Webb Calvert. He handled the title work on the Dawes tract for me. He's honest and he knows land law in this state better than anyone I've encountered." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Harlan's a small place. A woman going to a land attorney on short notice looks like panic." "It's not panic," he said. "It's preparation. And if I can't pay his fee up front, I'll front it," he said, and he said it the way one might say a plainly practical thing rather than a grand gesture. She felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with the legal trouble. "I won't take charity." "It's not charity, it's a loan at no interest with repayment when the matter's resolved," he said, with the patience of a man who had anticipated this response. She studied him. "And what do you get from this?" He met her eyes. "Nothing that has anything to do with this land." The way he said it was level and clear, and it had the quality of truth that she had learned to recognize, the quality of something that does not shift under pressure because it is actually what it claims to be. "I'll consider your offer," she said. "I'd like to speak to Mr. Calvert first and understand the costs." "That's fair," he said. They rode to San Marcos together on a Friday in early June, which was a 4-hour ride, and which, under any other circumstances, might have felt like a considerable undertaking for two people still navigating the early careful geography of each other's company. As it was, the practical urgency of the purpose gave the journey a shared direction that made it easier, and they talked on the road more openly than they had talked on her porch. He told her about the cattle outfit he had ridden with Longest, a Texas longhorn operation out of a ranch near Laredo, and about a particular spring storm in the Nueces Canyon that had scattered 400 head and required 3 days of gathering in mud to the knee. He told it well, with a dry humor that made her laugh once out loud, which surprised her. She told him about the winter she had spent mostly alone on the property during the hard freeze of 1880, when the creek had iced over for 2 weeks, and she had rationed feed for the cattle with a precision that still gave her a small satisfaction when she thought about it. Getting all her animals through that winter without a single loss was the achievement she was most privately proud of, and she did not often share it. He was quiet when she finished, and then he said, "Most men I know would have called that harder than it was or easier than it was. You said it exactly as it was." She looked at the road ahead and felt that warmth again, pressing at her from the inside with an insistence she was finding increasingly difficult to coolly categorize. Webb Calvert was a compact man in his 60s with wire spectacles and an orderly mind that expressed itself in an orderly office, and he reviewed her documents with the practiced speed of someone who had done this many times. His assessment was cautiously optimistic. The 1863 deed was properly executed and recorded. Beale's claim rested on the assertion that the original 1858 Beale land grant had been issued for a larger area than what was transferred, and if Beale could not produce an original certified copy of that earlier grant showing the eastern boundary as he claimed, the case would be difficult for him to make. His fee was reasonable. She could cover half from what she had set aside, and Lionel covered the other half without ceremony, making a note of the amount in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. On the ride back, the light was turning gold in the way it did in the late Texas afternoon, painting the limestone and the scrub in colors that were unreasonably beautiful, and for a long stretch neither of them said anything because the conversation had been full and the silence was comfortable enough to rest in. Then Lionel said, "Can I ask you something?" "You may," she said. "When you first asked me outright if I wanted the land, you said men had tried 4 different ways to take it. That's a considerable number of attempts for 14 months. "It is," she agreed. "What was it like, managing all of that on top of everything else?" No one had asked her that. Not with genuine curiosity, and not with that particular quietness behind the question that suggested he actually wanted to understand rather than express sympathy. "Tiring," she said after a moment. "Not the work. The work I know how to do, the having to be vigilant, the having to be suspicious of pleasantness, the not knowing whether a man is talking to me because he sees me or because he sees 400 acres behind me." The pause before his answer was long enough to have thought in. "I see you," he said. "The 400 acres are fine land, but they're not the part I ride 20 minutes each way to spend time near." She kept her eyes on the road for a moment. Her heart was doing something she had not given it permission to do, which was its own kind of trespass. "Lionel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, which they both noticed. "Yes," he said. "I want to believe that," she said. "I don't know yet if I do entirely." "That's honest," he said. "I wouldn't want you to believe it until you're sure of it." The review before the county board took place on the 12th of June. Etta sat at the front of the meeting room with Webb Calvert beside her, and her documents in order, and Lionel Kendrick III rose back in the public gallery. Stanton Beale had his own lawyer, a polished man who clearly expected to be in a shorter meeting than the one he got. Webb Calvert was deliberate and thorough, and exceedingly difficult to interrupt. He laid out the chain of title from 1863 forward with the clarity of a man who had read every document and found them entirely in order. He requested that Beale's counsel produce the original 1858 Beale land grant with the specific eastern boundary coordinates as claimed. Beale's lawyer produced a document. Calvert examined it for 45 seconds and then calmly pointed out that it was a copy of a copy with no certification, that the handwriting on the boundary description section was inconsistent with the rest of the document in both ink weight and letter formation, and that the coordinates as written placed the claimed eastern boundary in direct conflict with two other certified grant records from the same period that were already in the county's public record. The board took 20 minutes to deliberate and returned with a decision in Etta's favor. Beale's claim was dismissed. The Turner property's boundaries were confirmed as stated in the 1863 deed. She sat very still for a moment when the decision was read. Then she pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her and breathed slowly and let the relief move through her from the chest outward. Outside in the warm June afternoon, Calvert shook her hand and said the words that lawyers say when things go well, and she thanked him genuinely. He would need to be paid the remainder of his fee at their earliest convenience. She had it. She had set aside enough from the spring cattle sale, and she told him so. Lionel was leaning against the post outside with his hat in his hands when she came out, and the look on his face when he saw hers was not the look of a man celebrating a victory. It was something softer and more private than that, the look of someone genuinely glad for someone else's gladness. Beale will not be pleased, she said. He will not, Lionel agreed. He's also a man who doesn't like spending political capital on losing fights. I'd expect this to be the end of it. You know him. I know his type, he said. He went after the easiest-looking target he could find. He found it harder than he expected. Men like that tend to redirect their attention. She stood in the afternoon sun for a moment and then she said, "Will you have dinner with me? I can cook and I'd like to say thank you properly." He put his hat back on his head. "I'd like that very much." She cooked a proper dinner that evening. A roasted chicken with biscuits and the early green beans from the kitchen garden, and they sat at the table inside for the first time, which was different from the porch in a way that felt like a crossing of some informal threshold. The lamp threw warm light, and the evening was still outside, and the sound of crickets started up as the dark came in. He washed the dishes without being asked, which she found so startling that she stood in the kitchen doorway and stared at him doing it for a full 10 seconds before she recovered herself. "You look like you've seen something unusual," he said without turning around. "I have," she said. After dinner, they sat on the porch, and the conversation moved the way it sometimes did in those hours between dinner and true night, from practical things to less practical things, from the known to the less known. He told her about his brother Clarence, a good man and a steady farmer who had married a cheerful woman named Ruth and had 3 children and a life that was complete and content, and not at all what Lionel had wanted for himself, which he said without any particular judgment of Clarence, and simply as an observation about the difference between them. "What did you want?" she asked. He thought about it. "Something I'd built," he said. "Land that came from my own effort rather than inheritance. Work that felt like mine. And someone to share it with who actually wanted to be there, and not just someone who'd accepted the circumstances." The last part of that landed between them with the particular weight of things that are said simply, but mean considerably more than the words themselves. She looked at the darkness beyond the porch where the stars were doing their enormous indifferent work, and she said, "I have not had an easy time of trusting that a man sees me rather than what comes with me." "I know," he said. "You've told me as much and you've shown me more. Is that tiresome?" She asked, and she heard the vulnerability in the question and did not try to take it back. "No," he said, and he said it immediately and with a directness that made it feel like exactly what it was, which was the truth. "It would be tiresome if it were unreasonable. It's not unreasonable. It's the right response to what you've experienced." She looked at him in the lamplight that came through the window. He was looking at her with an open steadiness that she had come to recognize as his particular mode of meaning everything he said. "I am beginning," she said carefully, "to believe that you are exactly what you appear to be." "I'm trying to be," he said. "I'm not a complicated man. I want simple things. Good land, honest work, and someone worth writing home to. And you think I might be that someone," she said, and she kept her voice level even though her heart was considerably less level beneath it. He held her gaze in the lamplight and the cricket's song and the great Texas dark pressing in around the lit porch, and he said, "I have thought so for quite some time." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come back Saturday." He came back Saturday. And the Saturday after that. The Wednesdays continued as they always had, but Saturdays became a different kind of visit, one that had acknowledged what it was rather than pretending otherwise, and this made them both somewhat different versions of themselves. She was less guarded in a way that cost her some effort to maintain. He was less careful about showing what he felt, which in practical terms meant he looked at her considerably more than he looked at anything else when they were together. They began to share more of the practical work of the week. He had matters on his own land that required attention, and she was deeply occupied with her own, but there was a natural logic to helping each other that they both recognized and did not overthink. He helped her repair the roof of the smaller barn over 2 mornings in July, working with a competence that required no direction, and she helped him understand the particular behavior of the water table in their shared part of the county, knowledge she had accumulated over years that saved him considerable time and some potential expense. His foreman, a steady older man named Porter who had worked cattle for 40 years and possessed the particular laconic wisdom of experienced men, clearly understood the nature of his employer's Wednesday and Saturday rides and never commented on them directly, which Lionel told her made him worth his wages entirely on that quality alone. Her nearest neighbor, a widow named Clara Briggs who ran a small horse operation half a mile to the west, came by in late July with a basket of preserves and the transparent pretense of checking on a fence line, and spent most of the visit asking pointed but kindly questions about Lionel that Etta answered with a patience she would not have extended to anyone else. "He's a good man," Clara said finally, in the decisive way she had. "I'm starting to think so," Etta said, which for her was the equivalent of a proclamation. "Your father would have liked him," Clara said. That landed differently than she expected. Her father had been a judicious man in his assessments of people, suspicious of charm, respectful of plainness. He would have watched Lionel in the way he watched all men, to see what they did when things were inconvenient. She thought her father would have watched him repair the barn roof with particular attention, and she thought he would have given a small nod, the nod he gave when something confirmed a cautious hope. She thought about her father more than she said. She missed him in the particular way you miss people who were not demonstrative but were entirely solid, whose presence was like the presence of sound structure in a building, not something you noticed constantly, but something whose absence was immediately and entirely apparent. One evening in August, she and Lionel walked the length of the eastern fence line at the end of the day while the heat was dropping out of the air, and she told him about her father in a way she had not told most people, the specific details that made him himself rather than the general fact of his loss. He listened with the quality of attention that meant he would remember. When she finished, there was a quiet between them that felt warm rather than empty. He said, "He sounds like a man who did everything the right way even when the right way was harder." "He did," she said, "every time." "I'd have liked to know him," he said. She believed him. She believed him completely, and the believing felt like a door swinging open in a room that had been closed for a long time. She stopped at the corner post of the eastern fence, the eastern boundary that had been contested and had held, and she turned to look at him in the low gold evening light. "Lionel," she said. "Yes," he said, and his eyes were on her face. "I know I asked you once what you wanted. You told me. You said you wanted to know me better. I want you to know that the balance has shifted for me." She paused. "I'm not afraid of you having ulterior motives anymore. I don't think you have them." He was still, the way he got still when something mattered. "Then what are you telling me?" he said quietly. "I'm telling you that when you're not here I think about when you'll be back," she said. "And that I have not thought about a man in that way before, and I wanted you to know it because you've been patient with me and you deserve to know it." He took one step toward her, just one, and said, "Can I take your hand?" She held her hand out, and when he took it, his hand was warm and rough with the same kind of work her own hands were rough with, and he held it the way you hold something you have been careful about and intend to continue being careful about. "Etta Turner," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice with that particular quality in it did something to her that she did not have precise words for. "I have been more thoroughly and more genuinely interested in you from the first morning I came through that gate than I have been in any person I have met in my 30 years of living. Not the land, not the acres or the water rights or the property value. You. The way you think and talk and work and hold your ground. You." She looked at him in the fading gold light, the mesquite on the fence lying still and dark against the evening sky, her land spread out in every direction around them, good and solid and entirely hers. "The land means nothing without you," he said. "I know that sounds like a large thing to say. I mean it as a plain truth." She had carried the fear of those words, or versions of those words, being a manipulation, a performance, a prelude to a proposal designed around acreage. And now she heard them and looked at the man who said them, and felt with the quiet certainty of someone who has been paying close and honest attention that they were not any of those things. They were simply what he meant. He was a man who said what he meant. "I believe you," she said. And then, because she was Etta Turner and she did not wait for things to be handed to her, she stepped forward and kissed him, brief and warm and entirely deliberate, in the August evening on the eastern fence line of her land. He was still for half a second as though processing something he had not quite expected from that direction, and then his free hand came up to her face with a tenderness so careful it made her chest ache, and he kissed her back in a way that was completely genuine and nothing like a performance at all. When they separated, she looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing necessary to say. "Saturday," she said finally. "I'll be here," he said. The courtship, if it could be called that now in a more formal sense, moved through the rest of summer and into fall with a warmth that neither of them rushed and neither of them held artificially in place. It had its own pace, the way things that are real tend to, and that pace was steady and deepening. He introduced her properly to Porter, his foreman, who shook her hand with a directness that made clear he had already formed a favorable opinion, and she introduced him to Clara Briggs, who fed them both pie and asked Lionel a series of questions about his family, his finances, his intentions toward the property, and his religious observances with the unblinking efficiency of a woman who had decided she was entitled to the information. He answered every question without visible discomfort, which impressed Clara visibly and amused Etta considerably. "She's thorough," he said afterward on the ride back. "She is," Etta agreed. "She approves of you for what it's worth." "It's worth something," he said. "She's been watching out for you. She has. She's the one who sent for the doctor when I was sick that first winter after my father died. I didn't think to send for anyone myself." He looked at her with something that had become familiar in his expression, the particular look that appeared when she said something that told him more about the texture of her life than a summary would, the fullness of her attention when it was on the specific thing. In September, a difficulty arose with Lionel's cattle, a sickness moving through the herd that Porter identified as Texas fever, carried by ticks, which was a known and dreaded affliction in those parts. They lost 7 head before the progress was arrested, and the remaining animals moved to clean pasture. It was a significant loss, not ruinous but serious, and she found him in his pasture one evening in the early September dusk looking at the remaining herd with an expression she recognized, because she had worn it herself, the expression of a person calculating whether what they had built will hold. She said nothing immediately. She went and stood beside him and looked at the cattle with him in the quiet. After a while he said, "I'll need to reassess the winter estimates. The fever loss or the grazing costs. Both," he said. "I'm not worried, I just need to recalculate." "If you want another set of eyes on the figures, I'm available," she said. "I've worked through enough hard winters to know the margins in this county pretty well." He turned to look at her, and the look on his face was not the look of a man receiving charity. It was the look of a man who had just been reminded of something he valued. "I'd appreciate that," he said. They spent 2 evenings at his table with his account book spread between them, and she brought a clear and practical intelligence to the numbers that he found. He told her later, both immediately useful and personally revelatory, because watching someone apply their mind to something real and difficult was one of the more definitive ways of understanding who they were. He recovered the loss over the fall through a carefully managed late-season cattle sale and some adjustment to his winter feed plan, none of which required external assistance beyond the accounting support she had already provided. He was a capable man with capable instincts and the good sense to use good counsel when it was offered. On an evening in October, when the first real cold had come down from the north, and the world had that particular clear autumn quality with every line sharp, and the sky going orange to deep blue above the mesquite, he asked her to marry him. He did not make a production of it. He asked it the way he asked most important things, directly and without ornament, standing in her kitchen while she was putting away the supper dishes, and he said, "I want to marry you, Etta, if you'll have me." She set the plate she was holding down on the shelf and turned around and looked at him. "On what terms?" She said, and she said it not as a challenge but as the genuinely practical question it was. He understood the distinction immediately. "Your land stays yours," he said, "deeded in your name, managed by you as you see fit. My land stays mine. What we build together is ours together. I'm not asking to acquire anything except the right to be with you." She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the small hours of several nights in the preceding weeks, which was its own kind of evidence of where her mind had gone. She had thought about the specific terms, about what marriage meant for a woman's land rights in 1882 in the state of Texas, and she had thought about the kind of man she was standing in front of and what she knew of him by now, which was considerable. She had also thought about what her father had told her once, when she was perhaps 15, and had asked him how you know when a person is trustworthy. He had said, "You watch what they do when it costs them something." And she had watched Lionel through the tick fever losses and through the small inconveniences and through the moments when being patient with her wariness would have been easy to abandon, and she had seen the same thing every time. "I'll need it in writing," she said. "The terms, everything you just said put before a lawyer and signed." "Of course," he said, without a flicker of hesitation. "And I'll keep the Turner name as part of my name," she said. "I won't disappear into another family's history entirely." "I wouldn't ask you to," he said. She looked at him in her kitchen in the October evening with the cold pressing at the windows and the lamp warm between them, and she said, "Then yes, Lionel, I will." He came across the kitchen in 2 steps and took both her hands in his and held them the way he always held things she gave him willingly, with care and with intention, and he said, "I promise you something." "Tell me," she said. "I will never, not once in all the years we have, make you regret trusting me," he said. "I know what that trust cost you, and I know what it's worth. I won't waste it." She looked up at him and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific sensation of being entirely safe in the presence of another person. Not safe because there were no threats or difficulties. Safe because she was known by someone who saw her clearly and cared about what they saw. Safe the way good structures are safe, not because nothing ever pushes against them but because they are built to hold. "I know you won't," she said, and she meant it. They were married in December of 1882, in the small church on Harlan's Main Road, with Clara Briggs standing as witness for Etta and Porter standing as witness for Lionel, and about 30 people from the county in attendance. which was more than either of them had particularly intended, but which reflected the social reality of small places where significant events belong somewhat to everyone. Webb Calvert had drawn up a marriage agreement that preserved Etta's property rights, and she had signed it with the satisfaction of a woman who had made a decision with her eyes fully open. Lionel had signed it with the brisk efficiency of a man for whom the document was a formality, and the underlying truth required no paperwork. Clara Briggs cried at the ceremony, which she would have denied under most forms of questioning. Porter did not cry but wore an expression of satisfied approval that served the same purpose. Etta wore a dress that had been her mother's, a deep green wool that Clara had helped her let out at the seams to accommodate the difference in their frames, and she pinned her hair up with the same deliberate economy she brought to everything, and stood beside Lionel in the front of the small church, and felt the great solemnity and the great rightness of what they were doing simultaneously, like two instruments playing different notes that happened to make a chord. He looked at her through the whole ceremony the way he had looked at her on the eastern fence line in August, like she was the only particular thing in the field of his vision. The winter was cold and companionable. They did not immediately consolidate their two properties or operations. They discussed it and decided that the practical advantages would accrue over time, and there was no urgent reason to force a reorganization when both operations were running well. His ranch and her ranch remained distinct but adjacent, and the 2 days a week became most days, and most days became the ordinary rhythm of a shared life built at the meeting point of two individually solid things. He was good to live alongside. He was neat in his habits without being rigid about hers. He had a genuine and slightly unexpected facility for cooking certain things, particularly a salt pork and bean preparation that he said he had learned from a camp cook in New Mexico, and he made it on Sunday evenings when they were at his place, with a focused satisfaction she found endearing. She learned that he slept lightly, and that the sound of any unusual noise in the night would bring him fully awake and to the window in seconds, which was a quality she found privately reassuring and did not say so because it would have pleased him too much. She also learned that he had a habit of reading by lamplight late into the night when he could not sleep, and that his reading material ran to practical things, surveying manuals and veterinary guides and accounts of geological surveys of the Texas Hill Country, which said something coherent about him that she appreciated. He learned that she kept meticulous records of everything, tallies and accounts and observations about weather and soil and animal health that went back years in her father's hand and continued in her own, and that he was welcome to consult them, but was not to reorganize them, because the organization made sense to her even if it did not immediately make sense to anyone else. He learned this after a well-intentioned attempt to sort one year's weather records alphabetically rather than chronologically, an incident they referred to afterward only as the reorganization, and which had resulted in a brief but pointed exchange that established certain clear domestic precedents. In the spring of 1883, the county had another of its periodic difficulties with water rights, this time involving a dam that a rancher upstream had constructed that was reducing flow to the creek that fed both the Turner property and 3 other operations downstream. The situation generated a great deal of bad feeling and several contentious meetings at the county office. Etta went to every meeting. She spoke at 2 of them, clearly and with the specific technical detail of someone who had been tracking the creek's flow for a decade, and her testimony was difficult to argue with because it was documented. Lionel came with her and sat in the gallery each time and said nothing in the meetings, which she later asked him about. "You had it in hand," he said simply. "Adding my voice would have diluted yours. You're the one with the history here and the documented evidence. Why would I talk over that?" She had not expected that answer, and it caused the feeling she had whenever he showed her who he was in unexpected contexts, the feeling of a small, warm certainty pressing solidly into place. The water rights situation was resolved through a county mediation that required the upstream rancher to modify his dam structure to restore adequate downstream flow, and she received a letter from two of the other affected ranchers acknowledging that her testimony had been material to the resolution, which she folded and put in the tin box with the deed and the other important papers. In October of 1883, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before the day's work, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee between them, and she was characteristically direct about it because she did not know a comfortable way to be indirect and did not particularly value the approach anyway. He sat with the information for a moment, and then his face did something she had not seen before, which was a complete and unguarded joy that moved across his expression like the change in light when a cloud passes off the sun, sudden and total. He reached across the table and took her hand and said, "Etta." "Yes," she said. "Are you well? How long have you known?" "I'm perfectly well. I've suspected for 3 weeks and been certain for 1. And you waited a week to tell me," he said, not accusatorially but with the particular attention he gave to details that told him something. "I wanted to be certain," she said. "I'm not the kind of woman who reports uncertain information." He laughed, and it was the full, genuine laugh she had come to love, the one that came out when something genuinely delighted him, unguarded and warm and entirely real. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair and looked at her with an earnestness that she had to work not to find overwhelming because she was constitutionally resistant to being overwhelmed. "Thank you," he said. "I mean that seriously. For the information," she said. "For choosing to build this with me," he said. "For all of it." She put her hand on the side of his face and he leaned into it and closed his eyes briefly. And she sat there in the morning light in his kitchen and let herself feel, without any management or measurement, the fullness of where her life had arrived. The pregnancy proceeded without significant complication. Clara Briggs appointed herself an auxiliary support in the later months, appearing at intervals with foods she deemed nutritive and opinions she deemed essential, and Etta accepted both with a grace that surprised even herself. Lionel was attentive in ways that were practical rather than fussy, which suited her, though he did at one point attempt to suggest she reduce her riding schedule in the 8th month, and received a look from her that he later described to Porter as a weather event. She reduced the riding schedule slightly of her own accord, and did not acknowledge any connection between this decision and the earlier suggestion, which was its own kind of communication. In June of 1884, their son was born in the bedroom of the Turner house, attended by a doctor from Harlan and by Clara Briggs, and Lionel sat outside the door for 3.5 hours in a state of suppressed anxiety that Porter, who had ridden over to offer company, found both understandable and entertaining. When Clara opened the door and said he could come in, he crossed the room in 3 steps and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Etta and then at the child in her arms with an expression so undefended and so full that she felt it physically in her chest. "He's healthy," Lionel said, his voice lower than usual. "Perfectly," she said. And loud. He announced himself immediately. "Good," Lionel said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word and he pressed his mouth together for a moment. Then he said, "What shall we name him?" She had thought about this. "Hugh," she said, "for my father, if you're willing." He looked at her with everything he felt showing clearly in his face and said, "Hugh Kendrick, it's a good name for a man." "It is," she said. He reached out and touched the baby's hand with one careful finger, and Hugh Kendrick, 1 hour old, wrapped his fist around it with the absolute authority of the very new. The years that followed had the texture of a life fully lived. Not easy in the way that softness is easy, but deeply satisfying in the way that things earned are satisfying. They were good years and also demanding years, because the land demanded constantly, and the cattle market shifted, and the weather never fully cooperated. But through all of it, the two of them moved with a competence and a mutual trust that made hard things manageable and good things genuinely joyful. Hugh grew from a loud infant into a solid-footed toddler with his mother's directness and his father's patience, a combination that manifested in a child who said very little and then said it perfectly. He was interested in everything outdoors with an intensity that required supervision from approximately the moment he could move independently. In 1887, their daughter arrived, named Margaret after Lionel's mother, who had died when he was 12, and whom he remembered with a quiet tenderness he did not often display. Margaret was from the first a different creature than her brother, quick-eyed and expressive and apparently determined to talk from the earliest possible moment. She called Lionel Papa in a voice that always produced in him the same helpless expression, and she called Etta Mama in the same voice that Etta somehow managed to greet with consistent composure, though the composure occasionally required some effort. The two properties, in the practical way of things managed by two people who shared everything that mattered, gradually became a single operation in all but the legal documentation, which Etta maintained with precision because precision in documentation had proved its value to her. She continued to manage the cattle sales with a thoroughness that had built her a solid reputation among the buyers and traders who worked the region, and this reputation extended naturally to their combined operation. Lionel's north section proved to have better winter grazing than either of them had initially assessed, and they expanded the herd over the years into that section with good results. Porter stayed on until he retired in 1889 and was replaced by a younger man named Ellison who had worked cattle in West Texas and who adapted quickly to the particular requirements of the operation. Stanton Beal, for his part, had indeed redirected his acquisitive attention elsewhere after the failed land claim, as Lionel had predicted. He attempted several more acquisitions in the county over the following years with mixed results, and eventually moved his operation north of Harlan, which suited everyone in the immediate vicinity rather well. Etta heard his name occasionally, and each time felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a threat fully neutralized, a feeling that never entirely grew old. Mabel Pruitt at the dry goods store continued her operations as the county's primary information exchange point, and she and Etta had developed over the years a mutual respect built on the foundation of Etta being straightforwardly honest about her life, and Mabel being genuinely reliable about what she shared and did not share, which was a balance that served them both. Clara Briggs remained a neighbor and a friend, and in 1889 sold her horse operation to a young couple from the hill country, retaining her house and the immediate acreage around it, and settling into a semi-retirement that suited her considerably. She had opinions about everything and continued to express them to Etta on a regular basis, which Etta continued to receive with the patience she had developed and the genuine affection she had not needed to develop because it had simply grown without instruction. It was in 1890, on a warm September evening nearly 8 years after Lionel had first ridden through the gate, that she found him standing at the eastern fence line where they had stood that August evening in 1882. He was looking out over the pasture in the low golden light, and Hugh, who was 6 now, was sitting on the top rail beside him, having been placed there with the calm competence of a father who had been managing a small, energetic person for 6 years. She came and stood beside him the way she had stood beside him in the September pasture when his cattle were sick, simply present, and not requiring anything from the silence. Hugh said with the directness that was his inheritance from both sides, "Mama, Papa is looking at the grass." "I can see that," she said. "He has been looking at the grass for a long time," Hugh said. "Some things deserve looking at for a long time," she said. Hugh considered this and apparently found it adequate and went back to his own project, which involved something to do with the fence post and a piece of string. Lionel turned to look at her, and the look on his face was the look she had come to know entirely, the one that she had first seen in the kitchen when she told him she was expecting Hugh, the one that appeared when he was feeling something with complete and unmanaged fullness. 8 years, he said. "In a few months," she agreed. "I was thinking," he said, "about that first morning, when I rode through and you didn't look up from your fence post." "I knew you were there," she said. "I know you did," he said, with the edge of that not-quite smile she had recognized on that first day and would recognize at 80. "I thought when I rode back out that I had met the most formidable woman I was ever likely to encounter." "And," she said. "And I was right," he said. "You are also the most extraordinary person I've known. Those two things are not separate." She looked at him in the evening light. She was 32 years old, and the years had given her lines at the corners of her eyes from sun and weather, and they had deepened what was already clear in her face, which was a person who was entirely themselves without apology. "Lionel," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want you to know something," she said. "When you first came here I was certain you wanted the land, and I was preparing to manage you out of it the way I'd managed everyone else. And then you said what you said about the land meaning nothing without me, and I thought that was the most practiced line I had ever heard." "I remember when I said it," he said. "I was afraid you were going to tell me to get off your fence line." "I considered it," she said, "but you said it like you meant it." And I had become fairly good by then at knowing the difference. He reached out and took her hand, the way he had taken it that first time at the eastern fence, with the same care and the same intention, though 8 years had made the gesture completely natural, the way water finds its course. "Did you," she said, "mean it?" "Every word," he said, "then and now." She looked at the land around them, her land, their land, the land her father had built and she had held, and that now held her whole life within it. The pastures and the creek and the barn, and the house with the lamp in the window, and Margaret inside probably talking to herself in the way she did when she was alone with her thoughts, which were always louder than the average person's thoughts. "I know," she said. "That is what made all the difference." He squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, and Hugh, from the fence rail, said, "Are you two going to look at the grass much longer, because I am getting hungry," in the tone of a person who has been patient but has limits. Lionel laughed and lifted him down from the fence rail in one smooth motion and said, "Let's go find your sister, and your mother will make us something that is substantially better than what I would make us." "What would you make?" Hugh said. "Beans," Lionel said. Again Hugh said. "They are good beans," Lionel said. Etta fell into step beside them, walking back across the pasture in the evening gold, and she thought about the tin box under the bed with the deed and the legal papers and the letter from the 2 ranchers about the water rights, the documents that marked the preserved borders of everything she had built and held and refused to surrender. She thought about how she had expected every man to be a version of the same threat, and how she had been right to expect it until she was wrong, specifically and finally wrong about one particular man on one particular Wednesday morning. She thought about her father and how he had said you know by what they do when it costs them something, and she thought about all the things she had watched Lionel do when it cost him something: patience when patience was hard, honesty when easier things were available, deference when his instinct was probably to help more than she wanted. She thought about the word trust and how it had felt before, like a door she had locked for good reason, and how he had not tried to pick the lock or break the door down, but had simply stood outside it, consistently present and consistently himself, until she had opened it of her own accord because she had decided she wanted to. She thought about the land spreading out around her in the September evening, and she thought about how he had said those words on the fence line 8 years ago: "The land means nothing without you," and how she had thought them calculated, and how she now knew, with every certainty her clear-eyed and evidence-based nature was capable of, that they had been the simplest possible truth stated in the simplest possible way, by a man who did not have a complicated relationship with honesty. Hugh was telling his father about a thing he had found in the creek that morning, a stone with an unusual color, and Lionel was listening with the full attention he gave to things Hugh told him, which was the same full attention he gave to everything Hugh said. And this, she thought, this particular thing, was the kind of proof that no document required. A man who listened to a 6-year-old's account of a creek stone with genuine interest was not performing anything. He was simply himself. Margaret came to the door of the house when they were crossing the yard and called out in her carrying voice that she had set the table, a claim that would require verification, and the four of them went inside together into the light. Years later, when Hugh was grown and working his own section of the land with the practiced competence of someone who had absorbed it from the air of his childhood, and when Margaret had married a young schoolteacher from the next county over and brought him home to the Turner Kendrick property with the confident certainty of a woman who did not doubt her own judgments, Etta would sit on the porch in the evenings with Lionel beside her, and the country spread out in front of them, changing and unchanging in the way land does, and she would feel the full and completed shape of everything. There were grandchildren eventually. Hugh married a capable woman named Frances who had grown up on a horse ranch in the hill country, and who brought her own particular brand of directness to the family table, which Hugh received with a patience that Etta recognized as familiar. Their first child was a boy they named Thomas, and their second was a girl named Claire, and both of them learned to ride before they could reliably manage a fork at dinner. Margaret's schoolteacher husband was named Daniel Reeves, and he was thoughtful and gentle and possessed of a genuine curiosity about everything, and Lionel found him excellent company for the evening discussions that had always been one of the quiet pleasures of their life. Margaret and Daniel had 2 children, a girl and then a boy, and the Turner Kendrick land on autumn Sundays took on the pleasant chaos of a family that had grown well. She never forgot what the early years had felt like, the wariness and the exhaustion of vigilance, and the specific weight of being alone with something worth protecting in a world where alone was frequently interpreted as available. She held that knowledge with care because it was true, and because she had met other women carrying similar knowledge, and she wanted to be honest with them about what she had found on the other side of it. What she had found was that the wariness had not been wrong. It had been right. It had served her correctly every time until it met something that warranted a different response. The fear had not been the obstacle. The fear had been the appropriate tool, and the wisdom had been in knowing when the tool had done its work. The land was still there, exactly as it had always been, 400 acres of grassland and creek-fed pasture and fence lines that she knew by memory in every weather. Her name was still on the deed, Etta Turner Kendrick, both names carrying equal weight, the first her own and the second the name she had chosen to add to herself from a position of full knowledge and absolute willingness. She and Lionel were sitting on the porch one evening in the summer of 1898, which was a particularly soft and golden summer, with the country smelling of dry grass and creek water and the particular sweetness of Texas evenings in good years. And he said, quite suddenly, "Do you remember the fence post?" "Which fence post?" she said. "The one you were digging the hole for when I rode through the gate the first time," he said. "You didn't look up." "I looked up when you answered about Thursday," she said. "I know," he said. "I could tell. You were looking at the land," she said. "I was," he agreed. "And then I looked at you." "And then," she said. He turned to look at her on the porch, in the summer evening light. This woman he had watched hold her ground against lawyers and land brokers, and bad weather and tick fever, and the comprehensive difficulty of being fully oneself in a world that generally preferred something more manageable. This woman whose mind he had admired before he had let himself know he loved her, and whom he had loved thoroughly and completely from a point well before he had said so out loud. "And then," he said, "I knew the fence post hole could wait." She laughed, the full genuine laugh she gave to things that actually deserved it, and the sound of it went out into the Texas evening, and the mockingbirds in the mesquite did not even pause in their own considerable noise, and the creek ran on through the good land, the land that held everything worth holding, and the light went slowly gold and then amber, and then the stars came out over the Turner Kendrick property in their thousands, indifferent and enormous and entirely beautiful. The same stars that had been there when her father broke the ground, and the same stars that would be there when her grandchildren's grandchildren tended whatever grew from what she and Lionel had built together. This life that had started with a gate and a Wednesday morning and a woman who did not look up from her work. She reached across and took his hand on the porch rail, and he held it, and they sat together in the old and ordinary way of people who have loved each other long enough that the love is no longer a feeling that requires description. It is simply the ground you stand on, the solid, enduring, entirely sufficient ground.